Welcome to this free webinar on this fine February morning. And I say that literally because it is so nice outside for it to be February in the Midwest.
It's going to be 60 today.
Yeah, it's great. Love the break from the cold. This webinar is going to be based on the concepts around electrical safety for unqualified persons. There are some requirements from the NFPA 70E to work towards non-electrical worker safety. A lot of people focus in on those who are doing electrical tasks, which is great, and we definitely need more of that. But there's more than just electrical workers in a workplace, and there's electricity all over the place. So we are going to talk about that in compliance with OSHA and NFPA 70E, of course. So my name is Caitlyn Wininger, and I have my CESCP, which is Certified Electrical Safety Compliance Professional through the NFPA certification process. Started at Herzig Engineering several years ago, almost 5.5, 6 years ago. Yeah, time flies. I am currently training programs manager, so I oversee our training content, keeping it all up to date, doing safety audits, worker training, electrical safety program writing, all that wonderful stuff.
So I'm James Wininger. I'm actually a licensed engineer in Missouri and a few other states as well.
A few. A lot.
Well,
you're getting
working on it. But I'm the EDA manager. That stands for Electrical Data Analyst Manager. So I manage a team of 7 or 8 people who help input data for arc flash studies. I also manage the infrared service here, and I help write code audits for people's facilities to make sure they're in compliance with codes and standards.
Yeah, so we got a lot of good information for you today, but before we get too far in, I want to get a feel for the audience here. So I've got a couple poll questions. Let's see, first one. Do you have qualified electrical workers performing electrical tasks at your workplace? And you should have a pop-up now to answer that poll question. Yes, employees considered qualified workers. Yes, you have just contractors. You don't have anybody on site that does electrical work themselves or considered qualified, so you just contract it all out. Or no, you don't have qualified workers, or you're maybe not sure what qualified really means, which could be fair. So I see a couple people using the question feature to respond. There's also supposed to be like a polling pop-up so that you can submit your, select one of the choices and submit your response there. Let's see, we've got 74% voted already. Appreciate it. I'll give it a few more seconds just so that everyone can get familiar. And I'm going to have a few more of these questions throughout today's webinar, so I want to make sure everyone has a chance to figure out how to use it. We got 80%. I'm going to give it just another couple seconds, and I'm going to go ahead and close it out and move on. All right. So close poll, share results. So actually the majority said that yes, they have their own employees that are considered qualified doing electrical tasks, which, is actually kind of surprising. I've heard so many people say that they contract out all their electrical work.
Yeah.
And then, okay, Eric, you know what? You got a good point here. Both employees and contractors. Okay, I didn't make it so that you could select both, so appreciate you clarifying. That's another common thing. Employees do a small amount or, up to a certain hazard level and then contract it out for the rest. And then, for the rest that said no, you don't have qualified electrical workers performing electrical tasks, or you're not sure what qualified really means. We did a previous webinar on what it means to actually be a qualified worker and the importance of having truly qualified people doing electrical work. So I would encourage those who answered no or not sure, either way, to go back and look at the qualified electrical worker webinar that we did.
Where can they find that?
On our YouTube channel. Thank you. I do need to mention that specifically. So go back, look at that. And for the rest of us, we will continue on here. Hi. And I actually have one more poll before we get into today's questions, or sorry, topics.
Okay.
Have all non-electrical workers been trained on electrical safety? Okay, so hopefully you have qualified workers performing the tasks, and that means that they've been trained and audited in the whole 9 yards. What about non-electrical workers. Do they have any kind of electrical safety training? Is that even needed? So yes, some have not. No, or just simply not sure, which, if that's not something you oversee necessarily, totally fair if you're not sure about that. But so let's see. Already got about 40% of you voted so far,
Okay.
submitting your responses.
Responses are coming in.
Yeah, halfway there. Ooh, we got a good split here. Almost even split, actually. 70% of you guys. So go ahead and submit that. Select your response and click the submit button. All right, I think that's the same percentage we had last time. So I'm gonna go ahead and close it out. 83% of you participated.
Okay.
And 46% said yes, non-electrical workers have been trained on electrical safety. And then another good chunk, 38%, some have not. That's a common one that I see.
Right.
People who think that they're workers who are in and exposed to electrical hazards, but they're not supposed to do any tasks, often get trained, but other non-electrical workers don't get that training.
Sure.
And so it's kind of a judgment call that people make there. And then the rest said, no, we're not sure. So gives me a good feel for who we're working with and what you currently have as far as non-electrical worker safety.
Right.
All right, so for today's agenda, we've got 3 main sections, and then we'll close out hopefully with enough time to get through some questions and discussion. However, I will say that you should find that question feature in GoTo and use it throughout. I am monitoring those as they come in, questions, comments, concerns, stories, whatever you want to put in there. And I'll try to address them as they come up. Or if you get ahead of me, I'll be like, hey, I see, your question, Bob, and I'll get to it in just a moment because I've got a good section, whatever. I will make sure that you are addressed before this is closed out. You don't have to wait till the end for those questions to get answered. So we will start with electrical risk faced by non-electrical occupations. And then we're going to get into what those electrical hazards are, understanding how to be aware of them and avoid them, and what the 70E says as far as unqualified person training, how to get started with electrical safety for your non-electrical workers. So what can you do today to start bridging that gap, if there is one? And then, of course, wrap up with that question and discussion portion.
For sure.
All right, so starting us off, there are electrical risks in the workplace in general. We know that through statistics.
Yeah, so here you have kind of a pie chart representation of the total number of non-fatal electrical injuries in the private industry. In the blue, you have electric shock and electric burn. And what's really distinctive about this is people might see electric shock or might know electric shock occurs much more frequently than electric burns, but you can see from this chart that electric burns actually happen pretty frequently.
Right, yeah, it cannot be discredited. Now, realistically, electric shocks go way underreported.
Yeah.
Electrical burns are less likely to be able to be brushed under the rug.
A little more severe.
Yeah.
So.
But, even that case, these are the recordable incidents. You can't discount the electric burns, which could be actually electrical contact burns, enough current passing through the skin that it creates a thermal burn, a contact burn.
Right.
Or it could be from an arc flash, which is a term that not everybody knows about, especially non-electrical workers. So we need to make sure that people are aware. All right, so what's happening here?
So here we have some statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics on the number of fatal electrical injuries between 2003 and 2021.
Okay.
You can see over time there's a downward trend, primarily due to electrical safety trainings for qualified and unqualified workers.
Possibly, yeah.
Unfortunately, if you look at 2021, which is the latest data that we have, it's still not at zero.
Yeah.
With the goal being to get there.
Absolutely. Every one of these bars is summarizing hundreds of people's lives.
Yep. Which,
okay, statistics are great, give us some general understanding of what's happening in our culture, but it's easy to look at a bar graph and think, wow, okay, there's a lot of people dying, but not thinking about each individual person, what they had to go through, what their families had to go through, their friends, their coworkers. I mean, the impact is huge.
Yeah, this chart helps us determine as safety professionals that there's definitely more work that needs to be done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Another poll question here.
Okay. So, are unqualified non-electrical workers ever exposed to the electrical hazards that cause these injuries or fatalities?
All right. Are they ever exposed to these things that could cause injuries and fatalities when looking at these statistics? So got the poll open. Yes, it's just part of the job. All right, there's electricity everywhere. Of course they're exposed. Yes, but they shouldn't be. That shouldn't be the typical thing. Or no, unqualified people don't need to worry about this stuff. It's just the qualified personnel, the ones that are doing electrical work. They are the ones that need to be worried about electrical hazards.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see. We've got almost 50% of you already voted here.
Yep.
Very nice. Let's see. I kind of figured, I'm looking at the percentages so far, and I'm not surprised by which one gets the majority.
Right.
Give it just another few seconds. Okay, share the results. So most of you, I would agree. Yes, that is part of the job, but they shouldn't be exposed to those electrical hazards. So that second option being the one. No, unqualified people don't need to worry about this stuff is only true if they are in a pretty isolated role. Electrical hazards technically are everywhere, even in your home.
Right.
And so as long as they're not doing anything that could possibly expose them to it, sure. But otherwise, yeah, no, we're definitely going to be concerned about this because maybe they don't even realize they're exposed to it.
Yeah.
Now, another thing about electrical fatalities is that a lot of people think, okay, I've kind of already said non-electrical workers can be hurt or killed from this, but a lot of people think that that's going to be the small number of them. You know, the proportionally, it's going to be the electrical workers who are really adding to these statistics. But we look at what's been compiled by the Electrical Safety Foundation International, and almost 70% are non-electrical occupations. 70% of recorded electrical fatalities are non-electrical occupations. Clearly, even though they're not supposed to do electrical work and they're not supposed to be exposed to the hazards, it's happening way too frequently, even more so than the electrical occupations.
I would say there's some correlation to awareness there. What do you say?
100%. Yeah. So we can't discredit just because they don't have electrical tasks in their job scope. You know, they still need to know what's going on here.
Right.
There's a few reasons this could be happening, qualified or unqualified. First and foremost is working on or near energized conductors or circuit parts. Now, working on, you know, that definitely considered to be qualified at that point, at least should be, or near. So that's the part that maybe you don't realize you're close to energized parts, energized components, or maybe you're focused on your task. You're not supposed to do electrical, you're not supposed to touch it, but you don't realize that even getting close to it, you're within those boundaries and could be hurt if something happened.
Right.
So we'll talk about that as well. Contact with overhead power lines, you know, that is a huge issue in our workforce and just the world in general.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't even have to be at work. People are getting into overhead power lines in their own homes, doing DIY, hanging Christmas lights, whatever, all the time. So gotta keep up with those boundaries too. And then lockout tagout procedure failure or safety controls removed. So think about an authorized person. They need to lock out the equipment. They're not doing electrical tasks, but they got to lock it out. If they're opening any compartments that have electrical components in it, then they either need to be qualified or have a qualified person help them. And if they don't, then that lockout tagout procedure has failed because it hasn't actually truly eliminated all the hazards that are present, just the ones that they think they're focused on. Okay, we'll get into more of that later as well. Okay, so what are these electrical hazards that we're worried about? Kind of summarized, shock and burns, but can you dive in a little more?
Well, obviously, electric shock, arc flash, and arc blast are the hazards we're going to be concerned with.
Yep.
There's not a whole lot of research done on arc blast quite yet, but
We're getting there.
They're getting there, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of capacitance issues causing arc blasts is what they're figuring out, but
Right.
how to calculate that and
Yep.
protect from that is the key. Like whenever you know that there's an arc blast hazard, how do you
I'm
protect
sure
from
the calculations are of no concern to Unqualified.
that? True, that's true. Anyway.
They just need to know to be away from the hazard.
Be away,
Yeah.
yes. All right, shock.
Sure. So we have touch and step potentials here. So the idea is to kind of get in your head, what are the most lethal touch step potentials out of these three? It's pretty obvious to me. You can see from source to ground that the current passes through the heart, right? For the first and third, they're all bad, of course, but those two are significantly more lethal than the middle one.
Right.
But
most of the time. Step potential can and has killed people before.
Of course.
But those are not as frequent situations that we come across.
But also just think, an unqualified worker may be leaning against a faulty piece of equipment that may have been shorted out.
Yep.
And if they're not wearing proper PPE, like properly rated footwear, leaning against that equipment may short them to ground.
Yeah.
So you would have a touch step potential like you see in these images.
Right.
They might not even be aware of the hazard that might be there.
Yeah, I mean, think about how many times people put stuff on top of electrical enclosures.
Right.
Not just the electricians, which, I get onto them all the time. I see it. I'm like, you know better. Come on.
Yep.
But non-electrical workers, they don't think about it. There's a control cabinet right next to where they're operating equipment, and that seems like the perfect place to put their drink. They're interacting around those enclosures all the time. Not good. Or even an office space. There's a panel on the wall. People see panel metal. Hey, I'm going to use it to put pictures on it with magnets and stuff. And so they're touching it and moving, decorating around it and stuff. Again, they're not supposed to, but they do.
Especially since open knockouts on enclosures are one of the most cited OSHA violation.
Yeah.
Unqualified workers putting things on top of this equipment without knowing could have something fall into a cabinet and create an arc flash event.
Right. So whenever we think about unqualified workers, it's really anybody and everybody, because if there's electrical equipment in your facility or in your workplace, which I'd be surprised if you tried to argue there wasn't, they need to be aware of what they could do, because if it can go wrong, it will at some point. When it comes to getting shocked, it doesn't take a lot.
No, it really doesn't. You can see here in milliamps, which really isn't a lot. If you think about your panel at home, it's typically like a 200 amp rated panel. You can see it doesn't take a lot of current for the human body to respond to it. Clearly you can see the more current that passes through the body, the more of a response that you'll get.
The worse it is, yeah.
Right. And you can see all the different ranges of current or magnitudes of current that will affect the body.
Right. So even just a few milliamps can cause pain. It can cause you to get locked onto a circuit, all sorts of stuff. But, minor shocks happen all the time where people get shocked. They don't realize that, it's a big deal. If it happens and it's not addressed and it continues to happen, there's this thing called electric shock sequela that can happen. And these long-term effects include depression, memory loss, numbness, fatigue, chronic pain, muscle spasms, migraines, joint stiffness, loss of balance, seizure disorders, panic attacks, and a whole bunch more. Those research centers did a lot of investigation into, what's happening, what's the phenomena of people, having these symptoms at the end of a career, especially halfway through and on. It can happen anytime, but the more it happens, the worse it is, more prevalent it is. And they're realizing it's like even these minor electrical shocks that everyone used to just laugh off, like, oh, well, it's just part of the job. Everyone experiences it at some point. You're fine, get back to work. Actually, no, it's causing damage. And so even those minor shocks should be avoided, and honestly, stop calling it minor. So to summarize the electric shock hazard, 50 volts and greater. That is the cutoff. At that point, it needs to be a qualified person. So if you've got, general maintenance people, for example, that are just changing outlets and light switches, maybe lighting fixtures every now and then. If they're not qualified, they need to be. So this isn't the right training for them anyway. But if you've got, office personnel and they are like, oh, I've changed an outlet before, I do that at home. No, Not at workplace, you're not going to do that. And I would argue that they shouldn't at home either unless they really know what they're doing. But that can't be enforced, encouraged, but not enforced. At the workplace, definitely not.
Yeah.
50 volts and greater, got to be qualified. We also have the arc flash hazard. So what happens in an arc flash? How does this occur?
So you can see there's kind of the three parallel pillars there that we're considering three-phase copper conductors, okay? We're going to assume those are energized. And then you have a wrench across those three conductors or three phases. Clearly it's uninsulated. So let's assume you accidentally drop a wrench across these three phases and create an arc flash event.
Yeah.
First of all, you'll have a blinding light that will happen. In reality, you won't really know what will happen. There's no way for you to dodge out of the way, as some people might think.
Yeah.
There'll clearly be an electrical explosion as well, where you'll have molten copper flying out at you, which melts at about 1900 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very intense heat. You've got the pressure and sound waves, of course, and like we talked about, the arc blast, which is still having some research done on it.
Right.
It is known that the more capacitance your system has, you'll have more of a pressure wave come out at you. And I've heard stories from some of our field service techs, they've been launched 20, 30 feet across the room. Yeah. This is, of course, before they worked for us.
Yes, yeah. Well, and that goes to another point, they weren't aware of an arc flash,
right.
let alone arc blast. One of them, I talked about 15, 20 feet, something like that.
Yeah.
And
I've heard 50 feet before.
And he was like, well, before I had learned what arc flash and arc blast was, I just always thought, wow, that was a really insane shock.
Yeah.
So.
Right. So you have the copper vapor as well. Key point for that is not inhaling that copper vapor because it could cook you basically from the inside out. And of course, you've got the shrapnel, either from the enclosure, from the wrench, or from unmelted copper conductors flying out at you. So a lot going on here in an arc flash event.
And this can happen from a number of reasons. Of course, leaving items in or on top of enclosures like we talked about.
Right.
Dropping stuff in there, poor workmanship, if it's not installed right, and then you turn it on, it can go boom. Antiquated or improperly maintained equipment that, go back and watch our NFPA 70B webinar, it explains all that. Wildlife getting in there, and just a whole bunch more. And of course, the damage to the human body is immense if you even survive.
Yeah.
Okay. So electrical hazards, obviously non-electrical occupations are being exposed to them somehow, some way, and clearly not aware or don't respect the hazards enough. So we need to do better. We need to have that electrical hazard awareness and avoidance protocols, practices, training for unqualified persons as well. All right, Raymond, I did not overlook you, and also Claudio, I'll get to you in a minute. Is there a training requirement per OSHA that non-electrical working employees are trained, and how often? And I was kind of off to the side on my phone looking this up because I wanted to quote from OSHA directly, because I know in 1910.332 it does talk about the type of typical employees that face risk for electrical accidents and therefore must be trained. And of course, it's got electrical engineers and electricians and machine operators, mechanics, repairs, but it also has people like painters and welders and riggers. It's just anybody that could be exposed just at all need to be trained. And it has a little more information about content of training, requirements for unqualified persons, things like that. So yes, go look in 1910.332. It does specifically talk about training unqualified personnel. And then the other question from Claudio, I'll get to that in just a minute. I've got a good point to bring that up with. So we've got 3 codes and standards that typically we look for whenever it comes to electrical safety. We want it installed right, we want it maintained well, and we need to work around it safely. That last piece comes from the NFPA 70E, and this is practical safe working area for employees relative to the hazards arising from the use of electricity. Notice it doesn't say practical safe working area for qualified workers relative to the hazard, or electrical workers. It's everybody. So this applies to unqualified personnel as well.
It does.
So the employer needs to have a electrical safety program, documented electrical safe work practices, that follow the NFPA 70E and provide training to those practices related to their work. And the employee is therefore supposed to listen and comply with those safe work practices. That's part of risk control, the awareness piece of it. Because until all workers are aware of the hazard, they're not going to know what to do, right? So that's why it's so important. Again, just a little side note, have qualified people doing electrical tasks, anything 50 volts and above. Don't risk it with an unqualified person. They're not allowed to open electrical enclosures or work near exposed electrical components while it's still energized if they're not qualified. So specifically unqualified persons, it does spell it out that unqualified persons shall be trained and familiar with any electrical safety related work practices necessary for their safety. So the type and extent of training could vary depending on the role. Those who said that some unqualified personnel and some are not trained in electrical safety during that poll earlier, maybe that's totally fair. Maybe the ones that aren't trained are work from home employees. They don't ever come to the workplace specifically. So their home is their workplace. And I could argue that they should still have some hazard awareness, but it's not about, being in that environment constantly. Maybe that's the case. I don't know, but it's whatever's necessary for their safety. So even things like GFCI protection and cords, basic understanding of, hey, if a cord looks like any of these, don't use it. If the grounding plug's removed, the prong, or if it's coming apart or someone's taped it over, especially if you see electrical tape, that's a clear sign.
Oh yeah.
Like, hello, it's damaged.
It's end of service life.
Don't. Yeah. Some of them can be repaired depending on what happened to it, but most of the time, if it's taped up, unqualified persons, they should just know not to touch it.
Looks like a dog shit on the bottom left one.
Yeah, that's very possible. And certainly plugs, also outlets, I've seen this where it's got the arcing and kind of a melting going on. Don't continue to use it and plug stuff in, right? It could be things like overhead power lines. We talked about the fact that people need to stay away. So this training for unqualified persons as well should be, maybe they have a bucket truck or some kind of crane. They're not electrical workers, but they still need to be aware of the electrical hazards and not getting too close to them, whatever applies to their job, right? Maybe they go up on the roof to paint. I don't know, whatever the case may be. And I'm clicking the wrong way, my bad. Location, the underground utilities and know how to avoid them. Maybe you do some trenching work and you have to work alongside, and the whole call before you dig thing is very important. Please do that. Know that those red markers are the ones that indicate the electrical line. So there's the flags or the paint or whatever those people use to identify it.
Yeah.
Stay away from the red area, right?
Utility companies.
All these things need to be addressed in electrical safety training for unqualified personnel. Sometimes you also want to talk about contact release training. Now, specifically in emergency response training for the 70E requirements, it says that employees exposed to electric shock hazards and those responsible for safe release of victims from contact with energized conductors shall be trained in methods of safe release every year. I would argue even those who are not responsible for the safe release of victims and their job duties don't put them where they're supposed to be exposed to shock hazards, they should still be trained to some extent. Because, best practice is that qualified electrical workers, QEWs, need to use an adequate buddy system. But the reality is that's not always possible, okay? Oftentimes we're working in environments that, maybe the two-man rule doesn't apply because you're out in the middle and people are all around and, you don't have a second person available. And so you're not working isolated, right? Other people are in the area. And yet I see videos where someone's up and they're working and they freeze, they stop moving, right? And everyone just keeps walking by. They don't realize what's happening because they haven't been trained to look for it.
Nope.
Okay, so even in that situation, unqualified person, I think, should still be aware of how to identify it and what they can and can't do. Because if you touch someone who's locked on, you're also going to become part of the circuit more likely than anything. So teaching them that, this is how you identify it. Don't touch them, call out to them, see if they're okay. No response, time to start acting. If they're not comfortable, call 911, call somebody else, get some attention. But the time of the essence, the faster they can turn off the power, or if you have insulated shepherd's hooks, teach them how to use that as long as it's not getting them in the arc flash boundary, or other non-conductive objects that they could possibly use. You know, I hear 2x4, but don't let it be damp. Maybe one of those really big traffic cones or a Rubbermaid trash can. I've heard all sorts of stories, but
key point though, if someone does get locked on, you know, that's kind of a scary situation.
Absolutely.
So kind of think of what mentality you're going to have during that. Don't exert yourself trying to help them get off and end up getting hooked on yourself. That's kind of the point of the safe methods of release.
Right. And so, yes, the NFPA 70E says those responsible for it. But if that person's not around, if that person's not available, and let's say I was an unqualified person in your facility and I see this happening, I'm not going to want to just stand there and go, oh no, this is bad. You know, I'm sure most people watching this today are going to go, what can I do to help? This person's going to die.
Right.
Like somebody's got to do something, and I'm standing right here. I got to take action, right?
Yeah, in those moments, that's where training becomes key.
Yes. Don't panic. They know what to do. Worst case, they know who to call, but hopefully.
In moments of panic, training is key.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. So other things, you know, there's electrical hazards in the enclosures themselves. Unqualified personnel should not be opening and accessing electrical equipment like this, panel boards, disconnects, certainly not switchboards or switchgear or motor control centers, right? Overhead bus duct, all that stuff, it should be a no-go zone. And hopefully that's very, very clear. You know, if you're not an electrician, electrical worker, maintenance guy that's been trained and qualified, whatever, you're not opening electrical enclosures. Most people are pretty okay with that. Maybe a control cabinet. If there's a distribution power in there as well, they should be aware, hey, this doesn't look like typical electrical equipment, but there's also still that hazard present. You know, definitely specify those areas. But what happens whenever a qualified person has been working on this, or maybe a cover fell off? You know, stuff happens. There's vibration. You know, if you're not maintaining your equipment properly, screws can come loose, whatever. It happens. It's open now, and someone realizes it. Well, how do they know how far to stay away? Well, one thing you could do is train over the labels, really just 2 pieces. The rest of it should be known by qualified persons, but there's 2 pieces on here that even an unqualified person should be able to at least somewhat understand. Okay, so there's the arc flash boundary and the shock boundaries. Whichever's greater, that's how far back at a minimum they should stay away. Now, argument I hear oftentimes is that, well, the 70E is very specific, that if there's going to be exposed energized conductors or circuit parts, if they're working in an area with that, then there should be a barricade and or an attendant. Shall be a barricade and or attendant.
Shall and bold.
So great. People make mistakes. People forget.
They do.
It'd be better if your unqualified personnel were aware of it anyway. Understanding, you know, even what those boundaries mean, what the barricades mean, and that they're not going to get mad if someone says, hey, no, back up, right? Understand why this is happening. Why is that barricade in place? Why? It's to keep them safe.
I've even seen in some facilities the extent people go to make sure these boundaries are known by painting the concrete floor, the boundaries.
I've seen it 2 ways. You know, I've seen the paint where it's the minimum clearance per the NEC, you know, or like James said, they go and they're like, hey, if this is exposed, this is how far out people have to stay at a minimum. Make it super clear.
Super obvious,
Not always feasible, not always practical. That can change over the years if you have different equipment, whatever, but it's better than nothing. All right, now exposed. I keep saying this word exposed, hazard exposure, when is equipment exposed? Oftentimes we need to make sure that unqualified people know that if they can see metal parts, it's likely exposed. And I'm not talking the enclosure, the cabinet, but the pieces, and kind of give them a crash course on what electrical equipment looks like. You know, this is a conductor, this is a terminal, this is a lug, you know.
Those copper conductors we talked about earlier.
Just so that they can have a general gut feel of, oh, that's probably exposed. That probably shouldn't be, you know, open to where anybody could accidentally touch or approach nearer than a safe distance per the definition of NFPA 70Es exposed. So again, keeping covers on equipment, it goes a long way. Just taking it off or leaving doors open can leave electrical hazards exposed. And so even just someone walking by, unqualified personnel or otherwise, could be at risk. So Claudio, you had a question, and I promised I would get back to it. This is where I was thinking of, should a distribution board always be locked? That's a very good question. I would say that it depends on the type of board that you're talking about. It could be beneficial to limit access to like breakers, for example. As long as everybody who needs to be able to turn on and off equipment has the keys to unlock it.
Sure. Who has access to the distribution board?
Right.
Do you have non-qualified workers around the area where if they just decided to, they could open it? That's something to consider.
Right.
And if they could, maybe consider having it locked and only qualified personnel have access to it.
Right. It's the best practice. But then there's other things where maybe there is a justification for leaving them unlocked for quick access. It depends on what it is, but it definitely shouldn't be easily accessible. And if it is, then either need to change that or definitely add that to training for qualified personnel.
Training is key.
All right, I got another poll question here. We're chugging right along in these slides. You're welcome. I promise I wasn't forgetting you. I just wanted to get to a good point. All right, qualified electrical workers, QEWs for short, because that's a lot of words. Qualified electrical workers, QEWs, are supposed to set up barricades in attendance. So why do non-electrical workers need to know this stuff? The answers, QEWs are still human. Mistakes and forgetfulness can happen. Non-electrical workers may not recognize the point of them. And the more people who know what should be done, the better. Or all of the above. Which answer do you think should be the case here? Why do non-electrical workers need to know this stuff? Why do they still need to be trained on these concepts? It's 4 options, one of which being all of the above.
Okay. Getting some responses. Some good responses, I might say.
Yes, yes. Almost halfway through here. While you guys are responding, Kim joined a little bit late. Can I watch the video afterwards? Absolutely. Since you watched or joined live, you'll be sent a follow-up email that gives you a little certificate that, hey, you joined this, and it'll also give you a link to watch the recording. Also, sometime next week, probably, I will be posting the recording on our YouTube channel so that you can share it with anybody. You can also go back and watch all of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel as well. All right, we've got a good number responding here, and nobody was incorrect because the answer is all of the above. So you could have chose, a couple other options, but any of them is correct. All right, let's see. Now, another piece, I mentioned the authorized worker to do lockout tagout. Maybe they work on mechanical parts or pneumatics or whatever may have you. Okay. But there's electrical components in that same work environment. What they need to understand at that point is that all electrical conductors or circuit parts are considered energized until verified to be de-energized through the process of achieving what's called an electrically safe work condition, ESWC. That can only be done by a qualified person. So there's 2 options here. Either that authorized individual that's performing LOTO becomes qualified just to verify absence of voltage on that piece of equipment or the few enclosures that they have this possibility, or it's always a 2-man job. Okay, they're going to need a qualified person at a minimum to be working alongside. They also lock out, both, it becomes a group LOTO scenario, and then that qualified person can do the absence of voltage test and triple check and all this wonderful stuff, grounds applied if necessary, so that the other worker can do their tasks.
So what you're saying, Caitlin, is an unqualified person can become qualified for specific equipment.
Yes.
Not all of it.
Yes, right. It could be detailed. I've worked with a lot of companies, just checking time. I've worked for a lot of companies that whenever we write their safety program, we don't have qualified electrical workers as a blanket term. There's levels or classifications. Yep. Maybe it's broken out by job title, maybe it's broken out by area of the business, whatever the case may be. And they have different specific tasks that they are or are not allowed to do. most of the time, the basic qualified electrical worker is exactly the scenario that I'm talking about. It's an authorized person who their whole thing, the only reason they're ever going to need to be exposed to electrical hazards and wear that PPE is to verify absence of voltage. They don't do any troubleshooting. They don't, I mean, nothing else. It is just to verify absence of voltage because they have to get into a compartment that also has those electrical parts. They're not touching it other than with their meter.
Right.
That's it. Okay, it's very possible, very doable. Create those forms that, you know, do the audit and training specific to that. That makes it a little easier. Don't have to go through the step of having a second person just for that sake.
Right.
All the way up into a qualified person that could literally do anything in the facility that they could possibly need. Those are a little more, yes, those are a little more extensive audit forms, I will say, but it is possible. All right, so there's another kind of tip and trick thing. Again, going back to this idea that qualified persons can forget things. They are human, they can make mistakes. We want to hold them to a high level of safety. We shouldn't allow them to cut corners. But if it does happen, unqualified personnel need to understand that maybe they forget to set up the boundary, right? Maybe they didn't realize that there was an attendant because the attendant got distracted. Whatever the case may be. So there are some general practices that I've seen some companies use for their non-electrical worker, their unqualified worker training as far as the boundaries are concerned. You know, maybe they had really good practice of wearing their PPE, the qualified person, sorry, wearing their PPE whenever they open up equipment, but they sometimes forgot to set up the boundaries. And so they recognized that, and in the meantime, until they could correct the qualified workers consistently, they added this, for example, general work practice for unqualified worker training. And they said, you know, are they wearing electrical gloves? And that's it. As far as electrical PPE that you can see, you know, at a glance, it's just the gloves and protectors, at least 5 feet back. Minimum typically is 3.5, but they round up just to make it easy. You know, okay, did they add arc rated clothing? Maybe you can't realize that. Maybe they're wearing a face shield at this point. That's pretty obvious. Okay, stay back at least 10 feet. And then if they're wearing a full arc flash suit, got to stay back at least 40 feet.
Yeah.
This is 100% dependent on those workers being truly qualified and not taking shortcuts on their PPE. Yeah. But, you know, it's another way, another method of hopefully keeping people far enough back. And I'll say these distances are a little bit based on the category tables. You know, it says a certain level of PPE or category of PPE and then a certain arc flash boundary that's it's some are rounded up or whatever that hazard level is. Some of this is based on arc flash studies that we have performed in the past. So hopefully this is conservative. Again, there's no guarantee though. This is just a general practice that's as an example. So don't take this and go, this is how far it needs to go. This is just another possible way to help bridge the gap of understanding for unqualified persons.
General rule of thumb.
Yes, thank you. That's what I was trying to say.
Gotcha.
So this is kind of what it might look like. You know, hopefully they're wearing safety glasses and hearing protection. They've got like a uniform on. This is a qualified person example. So if this is what you see, they've got the gloves on, they don't got the face shield or a full bomb squad looking suit. Back at least 5 feet would be a good rule of thumb. Hopefully they've done this and their boundaries, but you know, stuff happens. Then we've got maybe a coverall, or they still have a uniform. It could be arc rated, got the gloves, and now you add in the face shield, maybe a balaclava as well. This is where I would say stay back at least 10 feet for unqualified persons. Again, hopefully.
And you can see on the arc flash label 50 inches for arc flash boundary, and of course the limited approach boundary for 480 volts. You know, 10 feet is 120 inches away.
Right.
But the point of that, just being a general rule of thumb, is that the worker may not even realize they're in the boundary. So give yourself a little extra room away from it.
Yeah,
what you might think.
If you're not totally sure, be further back than what we think is necessary.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then same thing for the 40 cal suit. You know, if you see someone in this kind of suit, I tell in my unqualified worker training, you know, stay 40 feet back. Or, you know, if you're not supposed to do anything in that area and you can wait until they make it a safe work condition again, just excuse yourself. You know, there's no reason to be around that environment. And certainly if you see that there's a danger label on the equipment, it's greater than a 40 cal suit typically would be able to provide protection for, excuse yourself. There is no guesswork there. Just get out of the room. That's what I tell.
Even if this work is contracted out to a company that has adequate
Right.
PPE.
Maybe they invested in this.
Again, they're wearing that suit, so excuse yourself from the area.
Yeah. It's not an end all be all practice. We want our qualified workers to do the right things, set up their barricades, assign attendants, and not get distracted.
Right.
But if all else fails, at least your unqualified personnel will be able to see, okay, equipment's open, somebody's wearing stuff, I need to get away. Instead of equipment's open, someone's wearing stuff. Oh, what are they doing?
No,
which is the common
that.
response.
Do not do that.
All right, so before we wrap up, I want to give you a couple tips and tricks on how to get started with electrical safety for your non-electrical workers. I know we were kind of all over the place about what content you could possibly train them on, but really summarize what you can do today. Have that accurate system study performed for your electric shock and arc flash hazards. Because once you know what the arc flash and shock hazards are in your enclosures or in your facility in general, then you can also know through that analysis how far out the boundaries would actually be. You can take out the guesswork as much as possible, right? Then train your non-electrical employees about the hazards, how to identify whenever equipment's open or exposed, if it's damaged, for example, like those cords even. Distances to stay away, and we talked about that a lot. Most of unqualified electrical worker training summarizes with don't touch, stay away, call someone if you see this. They're not going to be doing the electrical work, right? And then let's keep our qualified workers accountable. Just because unqualified personnel may know how far to stay back and when to identify that there's a hazard because somebody left a panel cover off or whatever, doesn't excuse the qualified workers from doing what they should be doing, right? So this is for their safety and the safety of the non-electrical workers. So verify, train, retrain, re-audit, whatever you need to do, verify that the QEWs do know what they should be doing and are actually doing it. Okay. And of course, if you need some help with any of those initiatives or anything else, that's what we're here for. That's the whole premise of Herzig Engineering, is trying to help people go home safely. So we've cultivated these services to do just that. Arc flash studies, safety training, lockout tagout, that authorized versus qualified thing. We can work through those nuances. Hazardous area classification, written program, safety audits, infrared, NEC equipment audits. Is it a hazard all on its own without people touching it? That last piece. All sorts of things we can help you with. Don't be shy. We can always just talk through it, see what you might need, if anything.
We are in Europe as well for these. Surprised you didn't put it on there.
That's okay.
That's all good.
Anywhere you need us, we'll figure it out.
We are global.
Yes. So before we wrap up and I open it up for some questions and discussion, again, use that question feature to interact with us here. Just make sure you understand what's required and why to achieve compliance and, more importantly, safety. Electrical work is highly hazardous. Electrical equipment on its own, even whenever it's not being touched, can be highly hazardous. That's why it's so important to make sure even those non-electrical occupations are trained. They know how to identify it. They know how to avoid it. And then side note, again, let's keep our qualified people accountable. Just because unqualified know what's going on and how to avoid it doesn't mean that the qualified people can slack off on establishing those boundaries before they work. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and open it up to some questions. Thomas got a comment here. Great training, thanks. Thank you. Only comment I have is falls another risk that should be mentioned if shocked. That used to be a common cause of injury or more injury. That's a good point. So like if someone's up on a ladder or somehow lift or something and they get shocked, maybe they don't get locked on, but it kind of jolts their system and they fall.
Yeah.
Or another example, I could use my brother's story. He was up on a ladder, an electrician, electrician, electrical engineer that focus on safety. We have a lot of talks. He was up on a ladder and he was, I think, replacing a light fixture or something. And he got locked on. And
277.
He was alone in a room doing this. Somebody had turned on the power to the building and he didn't realize it. You know, again, going back to verifying absence of voltage before you start work, don't assume. And he got locked on. And so he thought, you know, in that split second, do I stay locked on and hope this breaker trips, or do I kick the ladder out from underneath me? And he chose to kick it out, thankfully, because the breaker didn't trip. And so he fell. Thankfully, he was okay. But yes, fall hazard could be another problem from getting shocked. You know, your body is typically not in your control. Thankfully, he could still control his legs at that point. But typically, no, it could be that you get shocked and then, you know, you fall back because you're dazed and confused and hurt. So yes, that's a good point. Definitely, I also want to include that. Are you located in Phoenix, Arizona? Peggy, yes, we have done plenty of work in that area, and we can get you taken care of. Carlton, no question, just a thank you for the information and working to keep people safe in the workplace. Yep, we definitely take it pretty personally. Like I said, you know, as you know, my brother is an electrician, care a lot, hits close to home here.
Thanks for watching, Carl.
Yep. Great workshop, thank you, Claudio, thank you very much, appreciate the feedback. All right, that is the end of the list that I see here. If you're still typing or if you want to ask a question, go to the question feature, type it out. If you have a comment or a story you want to share, that also is always appreciated. But it looks like we actually are wrapping up a little bit early today. If you go back and look at the recordings of our previous webinars, we're like an hour on the dot or an hour and 5 minutes. Tried to leave more time for questions instead of running right up until the end. So if you need to get going, no problem. I totally understand. We're just going to hang out and keep answering questions though. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Dustin, how many people do y'all need to teach a 70E class? Oh, as if, you know, if we're giving the training, we don't have a minimum as far as, you know, if we're just training one person, that's what we need to do, right?
Yeah.
But I think typically we try to keep the class size about 25 people or less, just because if you get more than that, there's not a lot of opportunity for discussions. It gets,
especially if there's a lot of interaction
too.
Yeah. It could drive a 4-hour training to 6 hours.
Yes, yes.
Which, you know, managers might not appreciate from us. So.
Well, you know, got to do what you got to do, but work's got to get done too. So class size, as far as NFPA 70E training, is flexible though. You know, in person, online, even virtual, like a live online or self-paced, we've got it all, and we can work with you for whatever you need.
Yeah, of course, if you have a large amount of people that you need trained, you can do them in groups to make sure they get a quality training.
All right, Dustin, hopefully that answered your question here. Oh, I see you have a follow-up. I'll get to you in just a second. Wendy, do batteries pose shock hazards and are treated differently than regular electrical safety? What would you suggest? Batteries do pose shock hazards, especially the larger ones. We're living in a world that's the case. There are specific sections in the NFPA 70E now that discuss battery safety. You know, depending on what size it is and the voltage and all that kind of stuff, it could have different boundaries. And yes, there are other types of ways to address and keep people safe from that. So we would dive into those sections of the 70E specifically if that's a problem for you guys, or a concern, I should say. Rhonda, this was an eye-opening webinar. Thanks for the info. Great job. Appreciate the feedback, Rhonda.
Thanks, Rhonda.
Lakeisha, thank you. Yep, thank you. Awesome training. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Joan, non-qualified electrical worker opening up panels and switches to get information from equipment. Okay, model, serial number. Should I be wearing PPE? Not touching wires, just the locks on the door. If you're exposed to 50 volts or greater within those boundaries, you need to be qualified and wear the PPE. Maybe your qualification level is just how to don the PPE. But if you're opening up equipment to get models and serial numbers, you need to know what type of PPE to wear, how to inspect it, when to replace it, because gloves have a cycle of 6 months, and you know the shirts and pants may have specific qualifications, the safety glasses, all that stuff, and the boundaries, how to establish those work boundaries. You know, just even the visual verification of stuff. You're exposed to the hazards. So yes, you need to be wearing PPE. You're within those boundaries, most likely, and that's going to happen. So qualified at least to get that PPE on and set up boundaries. All right, Dustin, your follow-up question. Cost per class is what I'm really looking for. All right, so we will have someone reach out to you because the cost does vary depending on where it is and how many people we're talking about and when.
In the setup.
And the setup, yeah. So whether it's in person or online or whatever,
Yep.
We'll set up a meeting and we'll talk to you
For sure.
all the details so that we can get a accurate quote. Thomas, do you have some classes focused on batteries, EV batteries, modules, and pack manufacturing? We certainly can. You know, we have the knowledge, we have the resources to create that, work alongside what you need. And, you know, that's a good one to start just adding to our repertoire anyway, is have a class that specifically covers those requirements. I like the suggestion.
That's not a common one that's requested, but we do have senior engineers, myself included, but we have people here that have been in the electrical field for 30 plus years.
Right, yeah.
That know all about this topic and could create a training for that purpose.
Right. No, that's a good question. Dustin, I really appreciate your time and energy in this training. Thank you. We just had an electrical injury. Oh my gosh. And I want to improve our training process. Will this slide deck be shared or just the video? Wow. I'm sorry to hear that you had an electrical injury. You know, it's all too common, but I appreciate that you are spending your time sitting in and listening and trying to learn to, you know, help avoid that. So will the slide deck be shared? Yes. I will make sure this gets to you 100%. In fact, everybody who's sitting on this training, I will send you a PDF of these slides so that you can use them.
Mm-hmm.
And the video, of course, will be also available on our YouTube channel shortly, sometime next week, hopefully early next week. Okay. All right, well, if you have anything else, every time I say this, Thomas, yes, we will have someone contact you to discuss training, 100%.
Thanks,
yes.
Thomas.
Rhonda, it sounds like you custom fit trainings to specific needs. Is that correct? Yes, we certainly can and have. A lot of our trainings end up having custom aspects so that it can apply to your facility or your job functions directly.
Mm-hmm.
We also have just like standard stuff, you know, especially the online self-paced, you know, cost effectiveness. We cover a wide array of topics and people just kind of learn a little bit of everything. But for those live events or in-person training, we can definitely custom fit to whatever your need is.
Herzig Engineering's goal is to be a one-stop shop for electrical safety.
Dustin, awesome. Something else. Just keep coming. Oh, this is great. So we are in no rush by any means, but thank you everybody for attending today. And hopefully, oh, I totally spaced. I should have had this up sooner.
Oh, yeah.
Feel free to reach out. If you need to get going, no problem. Send us an email, call the office, go to the website. There's all sorts of ways to get in contact with us.
Yep.
And we will get your questions taken care of. And Thomas, I will make sure that someone reaches out to you directly so you don't have to do this. But everybody else, unless you've specifically asked for something, we can get in contact through email, phone, whatever works. All right, one more. I didn't hear if you said this, but do you offer unqualified person training? Yes, we do. It's about an hour long. Again, that's customizable depending on what you need. An hour is typically how long I think to really get the point across for all the different things that could possibly be happening on a regular basis. In fact, I'm just about done editing and having it uploaded to our learning management system, Herzig Plus. And so that it can be a self-paced training as well. With the number of qualified to unqualified personnel, it's quite a drastic difference. So sometimes qualified people, the ones that have to get in and work around it, it makes sense to do an in-person or at least a live training if possible, so that you can have that discussion and that back and forth. Not always, so we've got the online, you know, self-paced too. But a lot of people have been asking about it for unqualified persons to just be self-paced, that you just assign it to the vast majority of people that are in your workplace, and they take it whenever they get the chance. And so that is almost ready, like really close. By the time we figure out, you know, proposals and getting you signed up, it probably would already be on there, so that we can start that discussion. And we can do it live as well. That's no problem.
Yep.
Donnie, thank you for the training. Well, thank you for attending. I appreciate it. Keith, do you guys host trainings at expos? We are getting into that. You know, things like the NFPA conference and IEEE and National Safety Council. We've been trying to reach out and snag some of those spots. They are highly competitive and they fill up really quickly. So we want to go there. We want to host those trainings. To be determined. We will announce them through either our newsletter or some other let you know, hey, we're going to be at this expo, this conference, and you should sign up for the training.
Also follow us on LinkedIn.
Yeah, we share a lot of stuff on there. Another one that you might see is that we're starting to host trainings here at the office, right? So, we'll invite people to come to us, or we could do, something specific for you guys. So, Lindsay, thank you for the informative training. Thank you. And Joan, sorry I missed this. What's the name of your YouTube channel? I think it's Herzig Engineering 5 for some reason, but if you just go to YouTube and type in Herzig Engineering, we're the only one that pops up.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be too hard to find. But yeah, I think it's at Herzig Engineering 5 or something like that.
Okay.
So, all right. Well, we have officially hit 11:01 a.m.
All right.
The end of the webinar hour. Please feel free to email us with any other questions that you have. And thank you so much for your time and dedication to keeping even those non-electrical workers safe from electrical hazards.
Thank you all for the questions and your time.
Dustin, he goes, one more thing. Just kidding. Oh man, that's great. All right, guys.
I like Dustin.
Thanks, guys and gals.